back, part two. I'm trying to keep these videos short for you guys, but all right. So, um, what we could predict from a worldwide flood? Well, we would first of all predict legends, right? And it turns out that there are legends all throughout history, all over the world, in all ancient cultures. There's some sort of flood story. It's usually legend that the flood was worldwide. Um, a lot of them say that the flood was because of man's sin. Surprising, right? And some even specifically mention 8 people, which is what the Bible tells us about Noah and his sons and his wives. It's always a small amount of people that were saved on the boat. And this explains the problem that the evolutionists have with the genetic bottleneck. Um, I'll get more into that in a little bit, but this is an issue for evolutionists because they say man has been around for however many millions of years. And so the question is, why is the population not much larger? And they say, well, there must have been this bottleneck of some sort that cut back. Man, no, 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 no. The Bible has told us all along how old the earth is, how long man has been around. And once again, this matches perfectly with a prediction from a creation science model. All right, so another thing we can predict from the flood story, the Bible talks about the fountains of the deep bursting open. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, it's at least implying that there is more water underneath the surface. The fountains of the deep broke open and the water came out. So, a prediction we might make is that there is water under the earth. Well, scientists have discovered an ocean that is 400 miles below the Earth's surface that would fill our oceans 3 times over. Sounds like the fountains of the deep that the Bible talked about, right? All right, so some more predictions we can make from the flood story is that, well, one, we would have hydraulically sorted layers. You put a bunch of dirt in a jar and put some water in there, shake it up. The water will organize the dirt by density, right? Well, that explains why we have all these different layers of the earth, right? Makes sense. Um, they're not a geologic column; they're hydraulically sorted layers. Uh, we can predict that we'd have massive canyons and carve outs from insane amounts of water flushing through. Like the Grand Canyon. Uh, we would predict that there will be a massive fossil graveyard that consists of all the animals and all the people that didn't make it on the flood. This is kind of, when you think about it, the fact that there are these millions of fossils all over the world, that's kind of strange in just a regular outlook of the world, because fossils are kind of a rare occurrence. They need to be uh, uh, buried rapidly in order to fossilize. So just the fact that we have millions and millions of fossils implies some sort of large natural disaster that came through, wiped everybody out, and buried them rapidly so that they could fossilize. Makes sense in a biblical worldview. Um, so another problem with their geologic column is, and I'll get into that in a minute, but polystrate fossils. We have fossils, um, for instance, of trees that are running through multiple geologic layers. So if these layers are millions of years old, how did this tree remain standing for millions of years, not eroding and being covered by millions of years of dirt? It doesn't happen. So why do we find these trees sometimes upside down, sticking through multiple layers of the geologic column? Well, it makes sense in a creation worldview because of the flood. The flood would have carried massive trees and buried them rapidly in different layers. And so that makes perfect sense in our worldview. Um, Another insane thing that is just proof of a worldwide flood is we find fossils of water creatures on top of tall mountains. For instance, there are petrified clams in the closed position on Mount Everest. So, how's this make sense? Um, well, the Bible tells us that when the water ran out or ran down, it soaked into the earth and mountains raised up. The Bible tells us that's what happened. So when you get all these different animals and things in the layer of earth, and then the earth sucks up the water and the mountain arises, those animals are still there, buried in that mountain. And and the reason it's important to know that these clams are in the closed position is because when a clam dies, its shell opens up. So this clam had to have been buried quickly, so it couldn't open up when it died. And so, I mean, this is just—it's almost irrefutable evidence of a huge flood, right? So, more about this geologic column. This is a prediction that creation scientists would make is the geologic column is false, right? For multiple reasons. Young Earth, um, and what I just gave you about the flood causing the layers. Um, so the big obvious reason the geologic column doesn't work is polystrate fossils. I've never even heard an answer to this. How an upside down tree is protruding through millions of layers or millions of years of layers of dirt. That simply doesn't make sense. And they found a whale standing on its tail sticking through multiple layers of the geologic column. This does not make sense in an evolutionary standpoint. It makes perfect sense in a biblical model. Um, let's see, mammals have been found in layers with dinosaurs. That doesn't make sense in an evolutionary standpoint, does it? They found a squirrel in the Mesozoic layer. That doesn't make sense in an evolutionary standpoint. It's looking pretty rough for the geologic column. And these are just three quick facts I threw up there. There's a million examples of fossils found in the wrong layer or other polystrate fossils. There's other problems with the geologic column when you look at specific parts of the earth. And I've talked about that before in other videos. All right, so space. What would we, now that we've gone through genetics and geology and predictions we would make for those, what would we make prediction wise for outer space? Um, First, we would predict that we live in a spherical Earth that is floating in space. The Bible tells us that. It says he hangs the earth on nothing. And Isaiah 40:42 and Job 26:7 tell us that we live in a sphere. So that's pretty incredible predictions for a 6,000-year-old book, right? Um, we would predict that the universe is expanding. The Bible tells us over and over and over again that God is stretching out the heavens. We would predict that the sun, moon, and stars can be used to for signs and for seasons, because the Bible tells us that. God said, "I made the sun, moon, and the stars so you can look for signs and seasons." Well, we do use those for signs and seasons. We even uh, made our whole calendar based off of it, right? Um, we're on the same ecliptic plane as the sun. This is incredible evidence for a design. So basically, what that means is we're on. It's hard to explain. All right, so there's this great vast open area of space, right? Well, the sun, the moon, or I'm sorry, the sun and the earth are on the same ecliptic plane lined up with each other. The ecliptic plane lines up with our x-axis, and they call this the axis of evil for some reason. Um, Kind of just implies that there's a little more than meets the eye going on here. This is a spiritual battle, right? Um, so what are the chances that the sun um, or the Earth's x-axis lines up perfectly with this ecliptic plane? It's unbelievable. And they call this the axis of evil. Well, woe to them that call evil good and good evil, right? Um, and then another question is how did the Big Bang do this? The Big Bang randomly exploded and lined them up exactly perfectly for life on Earth. I doubt it. All right, so we would predict a young Earth from a biblical creation model. At least most of us. There are people that go with the gap theory and days meaning millions of years or whatever. But no, if you're taking the Bible literally, what you should be, we live in a young Earth. And this isn't a problem. I don't know why everybody has such a problem with this. We see evidence for a young Earth. Spiral galaxies. They find soft tissue in dinosaur fossils. That's irrefutable evidence. Dinosaurs did not live millions of years ago. I'm actually going to do a video on dinosaurs and humans and what the Bible has to say about it all. That should be a really interesting one. But I already did a whole video on young Earth, so if you want to check out some evidence for young Earth, check that video out. All right, so our oldest recorded history doesn't go back further than what the Bible says. The Bible says humans have been around about 6,000 to 6,500 years or so. That's our take on it when we add up the dates that the Bible gives. And this makes sense as far as recorded human history goes. As I mentioned earlier, the population growth implies about 6,000, 6,500 years ago. Um, and once again, this is a huge problem for the evolutionists. They keep trying to throw in these rescue devices like a genetic bottleneck that wiped out the human population, or no, that's ridiculous. You're just going to assume a genetic bottleneck um, because your theory is wrong. It's wrong. Change your theory. Don't just throw in a rescue device. That's crazy. Um, Biblical geographic details match up and line up 100% perfectly. That's no coincidence. All right, so we predict we will see intense elements of design. And we do. We see symbiotic and harmonious sequences working together, that if one wasn't there, the other would die, and vice versa, and they need each other to live. We see that all throughout life on a large scale and a tiny scale. And I want to do a video on that soon too. And we also see fractal sequences that I talked about in my mathematics video. Endless sequences in mathematics. The infinite. Where did these concepts come from before man? Because it is conceptual. Mathematics is conceptual. So who created these infinite sequences? God did. All right, so the reality of the situation is the Bible was always right. It always has been. It's never been refuted ever. Uh, and it's always, the more research we do, the more we realize the Bible told us even more than we thought it told us, right? So I don't understand why we're so uh, um, focused on coming up with another theory. This one works. The other ones don't. I've proven that to you time and time again. Um, and and so these are the large predictions that we'll make as creation scientists on how the universe works, how old is the universe, that kind of like large scale predictions. I didn't even go into predictions that creation scientists make about little details. For instance, uh, we predicted the magmatic strength of magnetic. That's not a word. Magnetic strength of different planets, and we went against mainstream science and what the evolutionists thought, and we were right. So, I mean, and there's a million other little examples of that as well. But here's the large scale creation model predictions. If you can prove any of these wrong, I challenge you to do so, but you're not gonna. So, thanks for watching, guys.